Hello, everyone. Chigozie Obioma again, and I will talk to you about excerpts from a, a, a fiction craft book I've been working on for quite a while now. So that book is tentatively called The Fiction Condition right now. Obviously, that could change. So I have been reflecting about what makes fiction work, and especially what can help you when you are a writer and you're working on something and you hit a wall of some kind, whether in terms of characterization or plot, just about any element in your work. And so these are some of my reflections from my own experience. So I will just give the talk mostly like a kind of a speech, but there will be obviously some suggestions, spot technique, strategies for, you know, revising or making your fiction, short story or novel better. So the fiction condition. There are times while writing when one, it seems to me, hits a wall. And there's a story you're trying to tell, and you find that having arrived at a particular point in the narration, that things are no longer moving forward. Here you feel somewhat stuck or cannot penetrate further than you would have loved to. At this point, I often recommend revisiting some sort of epistemology or origins of how stories began. So I think in them we will often find in these stories about the origin of storytelling, interestingly, the tools that we need to fix our own ailing stories. There are different accounts of why and how stories came to being. The European Western historians often say that stories began as petty forms of oral narratives meant to preserve edicts, histories, and laws and whatnot, important events in society. In the African societies, this was also similar. In fact, in some places in West Africa, we had griots who were repositories of stories and who went about telling stories to people. This was their job and their reasons for existence. So but at the heart of these stories, one thing you'll find is that not only did these stories give accounts or narratives about lived experiences or the human condition, they also were structured in ways that mimicked the human condition. So stories, therefore, were modeled around that. So to understand what constitutes a good story, you look at the constituents of the human condition. So what are these? So to look at the constituents of the human condition as to how they apply to the structures of stories, let us first attempt to define what a story actually is. So a story is best explained by a series of events or thought movements that simulate the logic of progression in the human condition. So this really means that a story is a catalog of events about or around a character or a group of characters, and that in the end resolves into some kind of conclusion. To that, a kind of conclusion that is integral to our understanding of something about humanity. So let's look at the properties of the human condition. So first, a story is a finite thing. That is something that has a beginning as well as an end. If a story is forever, then it is not a story. The phenomenon of our existence on planet Earth, for instance, is not a story. A part of it is, which has been known to have been finished. That is what has a traceable beginning and then a recognizable ending. And this is what we call history. So sometimes you hear people say something like, the story of America. This is wrong because America continues. Therefore, it's not a story. You can only have a history of America, not a story in the sense of the word of America. So, thus, a story like a human being is finite. It has a beginning and will have an end. Second property, the idea of the catalog suggests that there are more than one event. So now this means that a story cannot be what is happening now in relations to what you guys are doing. You are simply sitting, for instance, if you're listening to me, or looking and listening to me. So even if this talk should go on for 50 days, and you sit right here like this, why? There must be events. So even sitting and watching is some kind of event, even if there seems to be no movement. So you might say, wait a minute, is he kidding? Has he read stories set in classrooms or in courthouses? Well, that's a good question, because movement isn't necessarily about you living somewhere and going about. This is because the property of a story is not concerned with the story in itself, but with the reader. Thus, to the reader, movement is achieved when there is some form of interaction. So, which means that once you open your mouth to speak, then there is movement. And there might be the possibility of a story forming in that moment, even though the state of scenery has not changed. This is why we have works of stream of consciousness, the likes of which Virginia Woolf or James Joyce have written. Note now how most of the things I've been talking about mimic the human characteristics. So the finitude of mortality, the quality of emergence and movement. The static is, in human terms, dead, same as in stories. Number 3, property of a story as well as of a human condition. Characters. A story should be about something or someone making the movements and the interactions that become the events. So, and then these events are cataloged in such a way that we may be able to understand something about the nature of human beings. So the third property, so this is the third property. So the fourth property is that a story has to make some commentary on the state of our lives that is integral to, again, also understanding the wider human condition. Now, this is a complex thought, too much to delve into in this brief talk, but it is something that will unravel as this talk progresses. Now we have understood what a story seems to be. Have we? No. The answer is yes and no at the same time. We have understood its form, but not its content. For example, when I see you, I know what you are in theory. You're a human being. You're probably an American. But does that mean that I know you? Not exactly. I simply know what you are, not what you are made of. So, understanding the elements of a story as it relates to the properties of human beings helps us to understand what stories are made of. So, a person exists, then something comes one day that forces them to act or do something. That action or words cannot be simply done. It must interact with an obstructive force of some kind. In the old times, a kind of a villain. So the tool, bracket, internal strategies, strength, power given to the character is responsible for how they overcome that obstacle or those series of obstacles an interaction that we have come to know as conflict. So in fiction, there must be a shift or some kind of change or epiphany which becomes the byproduct of this interaction with the conflict. So a story then, in summary, must possess a character with some form of motivation or desire. And it is his movement towards achieving that desire that constitutes the events known sometimes as plot. So now let's look at these different elements in isolation. Obstacle/barrier. So let's say that I am an experimental writer or a writer of experimental fiction. I think that even so, fiction has to make you feel something. So we must feel something. People say that the worst state a person can be in a relationship is when they are indifferent. That is when things are really bad. If a person hates, well, at least they feel something. If they love, well, good, or the better. If they feel disgust, as an editor told me in 2013 about how they select fiction, once there is apathy to a text, they reject it. But if someone feels disgust or overwhelming love, then it has evoked something in them. So it means that at the end of the day, fiction has to make a reader feel something. So the scale of the obstacle that you put in front of your character, in front of their movement towards achieving their desire, is what can make or mar or decide the level to which, the emotional reaction of the reader, the level to which the reader reacts to your story. So let's give an example in Titanic or The Notebook or even Gladiator. These are films, but they give a good instantiation of what we mean. So in Gladiator, for instance, you have a story that is archetypal. At its most basic level, it is about a soldier who just wants to go back home after a war. He's fought battles, he wants to get back home. So you might think of this as a very simplistic story, but what engenders in the reader or the viewer the emotional response that we have, most of which is a profound sense of loss and sadness at the end of the movie, is because of the obstacle that comes in his way of achieving that aim. So the whole world, in fact, the cosmos seems to come together and obstruct this man's journey back home. The same with the Odyssey by Homer, or even Titanic. This is a man who wants to be with the woman he loves, but there is a natural element, almost a cosmic event that prevents him from being with her. So the level of desire, which is primal, wanting to go back home or wanting to love someone, is so strong that when it interacts with these almost cosmic barriers, the result is very strong, and the reaction from the reader is intense. So if you're faced with creating a desire for your main character that is not as strong relative to the obstacle, what you can do is intensify the desire relative to the obstacle by using a strategy of creating 3 levels of intensification. So let's say that your main character is called John, and his desire is that John wants to get his bicycle from the basement. What is the obstacle? There is a snake there. So this is the first level in your first draft. I suggest you intensify both desire relative to obstacle by creating a second level of intensification. John needs his bicycle to take his sister to the clinic. That is his desire. So now it's not that John wants to get his bicycle. He needs it because of a reason that demands that he has to get it. So then the obstacle is the snake in the basement is poisonous. Now note the difference. In the first draft, the snake in the basement, there's just a snake there. It could be, a garden snake that is harmless, and John could even play with it. That is not really an obstacle. But now we know that the snake is poisonous. So readers sit at the edge of their seat. What is going to happen when John goes into the basement? In fact, I suggest a third level of intensification. John has to take his sister, who has just sliced her finger, to the clinic and needs his bicycle. So you've just added the factor of speed and urgency. He has to go because somebody could bleed to death. The snake in the basement is poisonous and there's no electricity in the basement. So now you can see how your reader will react, because definitely there will be drama in there. John now probably needs to go with a torchlight or something, and it's going to be harder to see the snake, which is, again, remember, now poisonous. So these are some of the things you can do, again, to engender that emotional reaction from your reader relative to the need to intensify the desire to wait or against the obstacle. All right, so because of time, I will just go and illustrate briefly other elements of fiction that correspond with the understanding of the human condition and how this can help you in your writing. So one thing to note about the human condition is the idea of, or the dialectic between the individual versus the collective. So the fiction condition favors the individual and abhors the collective. This is again because of the nature of man himself. We are intensely private, individualistic, but also most often communal. A state of isolation removes the individual from the collective and expands the individuality of a person beyond what they can bear. And once this expansion has reached its unbearable limit, the individuality explodes and the state of isolation becomes sorrowful. This is what happens in solitary carceral state. Thus, in the human condition, the individuality of a person is at once contained and at the same time energized by communal living. A man falls sick alone. His feelings are felt by him alone, though he can share, but only a fraction of it. He sleeps alone. What he wears is on him alone at any given time. Even in war stories, when one gives their lives for others, we are moved mostly because we immediately return back to gazing at the individuality of the hero. What we mourn is his individuality, his loss of it. We wish that he should have survived while also saving others. This is a case in the 2017 movie, Dunkirk, by the great Christopher Nolan. When the British pilot, after heroically saving others, lands in German territory, and the lights fall on the screen, we crave his individuality. What is happening to our minds, in fact, is that We have wanted that someone be this selfless, and this man stands out of the pack and saves others. But our desire is that because he has been selfless by surviving and returning to his family, being given a Purple Heart or any number of military awards, go back there. So our desire is that because he has been selfless by diminishing his individuality, that he should be rewarded by gaining it, by surviving, by returning to his family, or being given some kind of award. So this is the paradox of desire, but a primal human state. Now, how does this relate to fiction? Reiser Kapuscinski captures that most nuancely. He says a person, an individual being, has 1,000 ways of conveying his feelings and thoughts. His riches without end. He's a world in which we can always discover something new. But a crowd, on the other hand, reduces the individuality of the person. A man in a crowd limits himself to a few forms of elementary behavior. The forms through which a crowd can express its yearnings are extraordinarily meager and continually repeat themselves through demonstrations, strikes, rally, barricades. That is why you can write a novel about a man, but about a crowd, never. So lastly, fiction as the human condition. The fiction condition repels the accidental. So we cannot simply write that something has happened without any recourse to the human effort, for instance, even though this is entirely possible in real life. There has to be more to an event. While a man can hate another without cause, probably possible, and be cruel to them in real life, in fiction, this is not possible. Or even in real life, it could be that those seeing him do not or cannot figure out the reason for this hatred, or even him himself cannot fully grasp it. But in fiction, the reader has an obligation to know why. Note, it is not necessary to be told it. You can simply have it there, clued in, scattered across the terrain in form of clues and hints, but it has to be supplied. This is why an event this anecdote that once happened. There is a guy who is a good guy, nice family man, good to his colleagues. He works at a bank. One day he goes in to work, and then armed robbers come in, attack the bank, and shoot him dead. Is this a story? No, this is not fiction. This is a tale. Why? Because we do not know what this man was trying to achieve, and even the reasons for his death. For that to be a piece of fiction, there has to be a movement towards a goal. And the armed robbery attack may or may not be the barrier to achieving that goal. So this is one of the reasons why the fiction condition repels the accidental. Thank you.